Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Welcome back everyone to the Fly Culture Podcast. Today I'm pleased to be sitting with previous podcast guests Peter Hayes and Don Stazicker. We'll be talking about the latest book, The Flies That Trout Prefer. If you haven't listened to our previous podcasts, please be sure to give it some time, as I'm sure this episode will be packed with lots of information as well. Gentlemen, it's great to be with you today. This is a little landmark for me as well, that I haven't recorded one face-to-face for a little while now, so it's been really nice to do that. And this, I can't believe, is the 200th episode. So it's lovely to be here with you both today and to celebrate this small milestone. It's great to see you both and great to be in some Chalkstream company talking with you again today.
Well, first of all, fantastic. Congratulations on 200 podcasts. And they're all brilliant. And, you know, we've listened to a lot of them, and I think Don's listened to every single one. No, well done. It's great. And it's great to be part of that again. And here we are 4 years on from when we last talked, you last talked to us. We're very much looking forward to it.
Me too. And it's been lovely. We've had the opportunity to have a cup of coffee, put the world to rights, talk about fishing. And I know there's so much that we're going to cover, and we're going to try and cram in as much as we possibly can over that time. But Don, it's great to see you. And both of you, we had our do at Malin and Green, and I know the two of you had everyone captivated with what you were talking about and the contents of your book. And I'm hoping this is going to come across to listeners today as well. So thank you for taking the time. But Don, I'd like to ask you really, what made you want to go down the book route once again?
Well, after 4 years, 3,500 videos and 16,000 still photographs, you might well ask. One of the reasons was we've actually given presentations about the book, and some of the feedback and the really brilliant questions we've been asked by people who've listened to those presentations and people who've given us feedback who've bought the book. We decided that we needed a sort of a practical version, how to apply what might seem blue skies theory to reality. And in that way, we followed Swisher and Richards, who did selective trout rather, and then did Fly Fishing Strategy, which was the book of how to put the theory into practice. So this second book's more about how you would actually use some of the flies, indeed how you would make some of the flies that came about through the research we did. But also, we just carried on filming because it's great fun, and we were learning so much from it. After a while, we realised we got more new material, and why not share it with people?
Yeah, that's it. We just carried on doing what we were doing before, but it wasn't urgent to write another book. It wasn't almost in our minds to do that. But Don got a better camera. This was a camera that would focus on the eye of the fish and hang on to it, stuff like that we really could see what was going on. You got more frames per second with this. So you'd be surprised how much can happen on 30 frames a second, how much can happen between one frame and the next that means that you didn't quite get what happened 200 frames a second, and you're not going to miss a damn thing. So we had that, and we were just fishing and filming. And then really what happened was every so often we hit pay dirt. And we thought our criterion of pay dirt is, I wish I'd known that. I wish I'd known that 20 years ago. And actually, in our case, both of us, I wish I'd known that last year. If it's that kind of a thing, and we've got some new film of rising nymphs that's never been done before, that really informs us about how to tie them. That's just one example. So we had new stuff, new pay dirt coming through, and we got to the point where we were talking, and we just said, well, people will really want to know this, and we'll really want to give it to them. So after a while, it was maybe 9 months or a year or something like that, after we'd just been fishing and filming like we usually do, we ended up saying, well, I think this is headed towards a book. Another 3 years later on, and it did.
That's wonderful to hear. And would you see it, you mentioned Swisher and Richards there, do you think it is a companion to the first one?
I think it is, yeah. people did say originally when they saw the first book, we'd mostly talked about surface flies and rising trout, and that one or two people felt that we hadn't addressed nymphs and subsurface fly. Well, the answer to that is, in a 400-page book, there's only so much you can do before you lose the will to live. You can't cover everything in one volume, but we've certainly gone more towards looking at the subsurface fly. There are some very interesting surface fly patterns that present the fly in quite a unique way. But the subsurface fly, how the nymphs actually ascend and how they move, what we discovered when we filmed underwater was that what was happening was not what we'd been told. Some of it was, but there were certain critical aspects that just didn't happen according to all the literature I've ever read. One example of that is I'd always understood that the gas under the skin of an ascending nymph buoyed it to the surface. But you can quite clearly see in the video footage we've included with the book, the fly nymph ascends and then it drifts horizontally, and then it ascends and it drifts horizontally. If it was being buoyed up by gas, it wouldn't cease ascending, it would carry on. And as an ex-scuba diver, it would carry on and accelerate, because as it got near the surface, the gas would expand. So whatever's under that skin, and there is some debate as to whether it's gas or not, doesn't appear to be providing a lot of positive buoyancy. It's actually the swimming action of the nymph. I locked myself in a little dark room for 6 hours and watched video frame by frame, which at 30 frames a second is a bit of a task. And eventually I managed to spot a few ascending nymphs. And when you saw this ascend and then horizontal drift pattern, almost like a sawtooth, once you've seen one, seeing the next one is easier, and the one after that is easier still. So for a trout that's seen thousands, if not millions, surely that motion is an absolute trigger. So it's not only what your fly looks like, what it does. And perhaps the Tenkara guys and some of the Euro nymph guys who've been working the fly vertically by tapping the rod have really got something there.
Yeah, and the other thing is that with rising nymphs, and this is rising nymphs as opposed to drifting nymphs, so don't throw away your old nymph patterns, because actually they're still very valid for drifting nymphs. But for rising nymphs, what we filmed was the trout seeing them, and seeing them 10, 12 feet away as they come out of the substructure, out of the weed or off the bottom, and manoeuvring themselves very quickly into position to intercept them. And you're able to watch the films in the book, as it were. It's a free video with the book. You can watch the nymphs coming up. You can watch the fish spotting them and intercepting them, and doing that at the same time as they're looking for hatching nymphs and floating vulnerable flies coming down in the surface. And there's really good footage there of a wild trout on the Itchen, and there are other videos as well, but this is one particular one where it's an absolutely beautiful statement of what trout do and what trout do well, and what you've got to click into with the way you fish to get success.
That's a wonderful tip already, and it's already got me thinking about that movement, the vertical move and then the horizontal. Is it the vertical that's the trigger and the horizontal's the eating process for the fish? Is that what the fish is waiting for?
10 out of 10, that's exactly the question to ask. When the fish is underwater, there's a huge amount of particles coming at it, air bubbles, inorganic things, bits of vegetation. Particularly if you've got something like cows or a swan upstream, there's any amount of junk coming at the fish, and it's all coming directly at it. So when the fly drifts horizontally, it's coming directly at the fish. When it rises, it's going at right angles to the motion of everything else. And the example I would give, if you've ever seen Strangers on a Train, the Hitchcock film, they're playing tennis, and Hitchcock films the audience, and the audience are moving their heads from left to right as the ball goes, except the bad guy who's looking straight at the camera. And so you've got this motion that is completely different to the motion of everything else in the river. And that's got to be the reason why induced takes and similar vertical motion of the fly are such a major factor. An absolute dead drift, maybe it doesn't stand out quite as well. It'll still be taken, but I think what I noticed for me with my human eyes looking at it, once I'd seen that vertical motion, I knew how to spot them. You'll get the odd vertical thing, air bubbles rise up and methane and things like that. And in turbulence, you'll get different things, but fundamentally everything's coming at the fish, and any motion that is different to that will stand out.
That's really fascinating. I'm already thinking about a fishing application, Peter, for this. Does that mean with our nymphs that we should be thinking about lifting them a little bit, holding, letting them drift, lift a little bit more? Would that be the technique we should be thinking about?
Yes, I think the lesson that we've learned from that is that rising nymphs can be made to look like the rising artificial nymphs can be made to look like the rising natural nymph. We can't actually mimic they use that sort of porpoising legs together technique that Olympic swimmers use when they're swimming underwater, and so they wiggle like swimming porpoises, but and they're silver as well, or silverish. And their heads tend to be very silver as well. So you can put this together in flies, and that's what we've done in the book, several patterns, different weights. In some cases you need to get down and then raise up. Others you just need to let them come down at a standard horizontal swim towards the trout. But we can mimic one of the dominant shapes of the body, which is curved. And it's curved the other way up. So if you tie a curved nymph, on the whole it's tied by people to have the hook point hanging down, and it's curved with the back is curved from the front down to it's actually the other way around. So the stuff that we learn about tying nymphs to catch fish that are eating rising nymphs is again different.
Again, some fascinating points that I'm sure it's getting listeners thinking about. And, we live in a world of instant gratification where things happen quickly. It's easy to write something, but I think it's fair to say that you guys have invested so much time in this whole process from the beginning of the first book right the way up. And I'm sure listeners are already getting a sense that you've done so much and spent so much time that this is factual, isn't it? It's not sort of speculation. It really is factual stuff that you're backing your book with.
I think what we're hoping to do by showing people high resolution photography and video is that we don't come across saying, this happens. If we say this happens, go and look at the video and you'll see it happen, and you can make your own mind up. Now, obviously, when you look at any kind of behaviour on a video or a still photograph, you're interpreting it, and different people will interpret it in different ways. But I've got to say, when you show these videos to people in presentations and say, I think this happens, very few people seem to think that you're wrong, because some of this behaviour that we've managed to film is so apparent. You can only extrapolate it to how it would work in fishing. Like I'm saying, obviously this vertical movement makes the nymph stand out. So the assumption is that would help the trout to spot it. Well, it certainly helped me to spot it. But I think, the fact that you can show someone a video. One person we talked about with the book when we were writing the first book disagreed with the fact that we said that fish don't suck flies off the surface. When we showed him a video of the fly pouring into the trout's mouth filmed on an American spring creek, he did have to sort of admit that, that wasn't what he'd originally thought. And it's not that you're trying to be clever with this stuff, it's that with modern technology, as Peter said, the current camera we've got is absolutely jaw-dropping thing. It'll focus on almost anything. You can focus on a mayfly in flight. And so you can see things that the human eye never saw. I mean, I shot a picture of a mayfly, and obviously you've got the forewings and the hind wings. I didn't realise they fit perfectly together when the thing's flying to act as one aerofoil. And there's stuff like that. The thing flitters past you and you think you've seen what's happening. But with the modern technology, you can freeze that or you can review it. And it just shows you stuff we've never been able to see before.
And this is the wonderful thing, isn't it? That technology has allowed you to open up the trout's world for us to learn from, and from by reading your books that we're able to do that. And one of the words that seems to be echoing back to me from what you're saying is vulnerability. And is that a key word when you studied the behaviour of feeding fish, Peter? Absolutely.
The most common situation that you find on the river as a fly fisherman, and you'd like to fish dry, maybe you can't because you can't see what's going on. You don't know what to imitate. The most common situation is that there are some fish rising. You can't see what they're eating. And increasingly in recent years, there aren't any upwing fly hatching. So what do? I mean, what is the problem? Well, a really good camera can let you see what those fish are actually eating. And there's a lovely example, which was that I was on the Derbyshire Wye trying to catch a very, very educated, very large rainbow trout. And in the end, in frustration, I called up to Don, who's standing behind a tree with a 1,000mm lens, and what is that fish eating? And he said, well, I can tell you, looking into the camera, he said, I can tell you it's 5/8 inches long. It's a light olive in colour, and I can't see any bits sticking out. It's like a cigar. So I went into my fly box, took out an absolutely beautiful upwing mayfly dun, which I'd tied with the most beautiful wings and lovely tails and legs and hackle and everything, cut everything off it, proofed it, threw it at the fish, and it came up and ate it first time. In that case, I actually landed it. But, so what you learn is something that you can turn into flies that portray vulnerability to the fish, because that's what the fish wants. The fish does not want to spend additional energy that it doesn't need to spend. So it doesn't want to go chasing after things that are going to fly away. It doesn't want to spend too much time waiting for perfect duns, which it finds hard to see through the surface anyway. What it wants is to eat things that are either failed hatchers, so they've still halfway out of the shuck or part way out of the shuck, or one bit left in the shuck. They can't get away. They're in the film. If they've been tossed by the current or the wind, they may be under the film, but they'll be in and absolutely around the film. And the other category is casualties. People have called them cripples. We tend not to. We think casualties are, on the whole, perfect flies that have just had a bad accident and, they fell over or they flapped too hard or whatever it may be. And they end up in the surface, but more on top of the surface. And they present in different ways, but ways that are absolutely recognizable by the trout. And that's how we got into this in book form, was that we started tying more and more experimental flies than we had before, and testing them. And we test them against trout. First of all, we test them against the camera. So we cast them at the camera, see how they perform. They fall onto and into the water. We discover, for example, that it is absolutely impossible to cast any supposed dry fly artificial that doesn't penetrate the surface, and therefore that doesn't get interpreted as a vulnerable fly. But we can do better than a classic fly that we just throw and have it penetrate the surface, because we can get closer to what the underwater camera shows us the fish actually see. And we have some examples of that.
Well, one example for me, I had the fortune to fish on the Kennet, where Goddard and Clark did some of the filming for Trout and the Fly. So typically my one day in my life, I get to fish this beautiful bit of water. It's absolutely hailing down with rain. And I found 3 rising fish. There was the odd upwing coming off. And I put all the usual suspects over them, dun patterns that you thought would have been successful, for about half an hour without rising any of these fish. And then I thought, well, if I can see these duns in the air and this rain's coming down this heavily, surely some of these duns are being knocked into the surface. So I put on one of the casualty patterns we've developed, which lies flush in the surface as if the fly's been knocked over and its wings have become stuck. And I caught the 3 fish in 3 casts. I sampled what one of them had eaten, and it was full of bedraggled casualty duns. Now, okay, that's a fish sample of 1, but being able to do that with a fly I've developed for a reason, that's what keeps me fly fishing. And I think the important thing is we've actually put these flies over cameras and looked at them from underwater and above the surface, because it's so easy to tie a fly and assume how it's going to perform. And it's quite remarkable, really, if you think about it, that the sort of entire dry fly thing with Halford, they drew these wonderful pictures of flies standing on the tips of the tail with the hook kissing the surface, supported perfectly by the hackle. And I can't put a fly on a tank with a pair of tweezers to make it do that, never mind cast it 30 feet. So did they never drift their flies past themselves and look and say, these aren't fishing the way we thought? But then lots of people didn't wade, so maybe they didn't.
Well, you then think to yourself, well, what does a casualty fly look like from underwater? And so you set up your camera so that in the end, and it takes a long time to get the perfect shot, but in the end it'll get a picture from underwater, from pretty much exactly where the trout is going to be lying and feeding, of, let's say, a spinner or a perfect dun or a casualty, and then you start to get those pictures. And Marinaro said in his book, this is the most important photograph a fly fisher will ever see. And we got 2 of those, and they're completely different because they're taken from underwater. They're looking up into the light. What does the trout see of a spinner caught in the surface? The answer is, well, it sees the thorax and the abdomen, absolutely core, really totally recognizable. Usually the abdomen is curved. Usually the thorax is a lot bigger and thicker. Yes, it can see some colour. And what does it see of the wings? Well, very, very little. And bear in mind, we'll come on to it in a moment, but the trout's acuity of vision is 1/14 of ours. So it actually is going to see a kind of a fuzzy mess, if anything, and pretty transparent. And we'll come on to fuzzy flies in a minute, but this is really, really important. But when you see that, it is one of the important things that a fly fisherman can see, is what a spinner, and then you look at a casualty, it's much the same. The wings are slightly darker because it's a dun, but otherwise not different. And you look at a dun, and it's absolutely revealing because the abdomen looks straight, although it is in fact curved, but it's curved upwards, so it looks straight to the trout. The wings are really quite just like a Swisher and Richards no hackle dun. Those wings are quite highly defined, and you can see them going up in a V apart. The sight of that is very, very different from all the classic perfect hatched duns that have ever been tied. And so, that's driven us back into tying examples of flies to tempt fish that look different from those that we have traditionally been kind of handed down to use.
And listeners are already going to get a sense of this is real. I'm getting excited listening to this, and this is revolutionary stuff. It really is. And there's so many questions starting to form in my mind. I wanted to segue onto the fish vision section of it because of what you'd said about, the leads also next on to the patterns, of course. But I was thinking about what Don spotted with his lens and the fish vision section of this, because I think this is really crucial as well, isn't it? Because what you've uncovered about this and what you've learned has led beautifully into what you've been writing about as well. And you've made these, and I think it's fair to say, discoveries, because nobody has looked at these things before in such detail, in such depth. But can you give us, and Peter alluded to that, but Don, perhaps, can you give us a little bit of an idea of what you discovered about fish vision and how that impacted you? And as a result, we'll move on to the flies after that as well.
Well, I think the common word now in internet parlance is spoiler alert. And if you're a fly tyer who includes vast amounts of detail in your fly, you'd probably better switch off now. I've read for many years in lots of different fishing books and magazines the sentence, "We will never see through the eyes of a trout." Well, I'm here to tell you we can. Basically, what's happened is they've measured the physical properties of the trout's eye by shining light through it and working out how the lens system works. And you can now enter into a computer program the parameters of the trout's eye, the size of the item you're looking at, and how far it is away. And this program will produce an image as the trout would see it. And it is very blurred. It's not the highly acute vision that we've always ascribed to these educated trout. Oh, it's watching it at 3 inches. Every detail must be crystal clear. Therefore, we must replicate it in a fly. I tried a mayfly dun pattern that I use, and this is ribbed with button thread. It's about 1 millimetre thick brown rib, and at 12 inches away, the trout cannot see that rib at all. So much for segmentation in flies. As it drifts closer, it becomes gradually clear until at about 3 inches, that's the optimal point of vision for the trout. And what a surprise, that's about the distance we see trout drift downstream underneath our flies examining them. And the result of this is that a lot of the detail we're putting into flies is not actually apparent to the fish. And one thing I've always been told is that you should never use a solid colour of dubbing. You should always use a mixture of different fibres to give it the sparkle of life, whatever that's supposed to be. Well, this stuff's so blurred that you can put as many different colours fibres in you want. It'll still look like a single colour. So I'm not sure that using variegated dubbing, I'm sure many people will disagree because they've used it and it's been successful, but I don't think the trout can see it. And so a lot of the fine detail we've put in is not visible to the fish. And I think that's a real game changer for me. I've always tended to tie relatively simple flies. Lots of people have asked me why I don't rib dry flies. Well, the reason I don't is modern thread's so strong I don't need it for strength. And I don't believe that the segmentation is particularly visible. And certainly having seen this research now, that's confirmed it for me, really.
And in the many, thousands of hours of video that we've filmed of fish assessing both natural and artificial flies, it is quite clear that, roughly speaking, 3 inches is the point at which they're going to decline to eat the fly, if they're going to decline to eat the fly. It's at 3 inches with maximal detail as far as the trout's concerned. That's the best he can see the fly. That's the point at which we need to convince them that this is. And the great news is that because we're trying to show the trout vulnerability, we can show him a mess surrounding a core target that he knows is nutritious because he can see it. If we can get that mess right, and then we'll be catching fish because they know it won't fly away. It's easy meat. And the other thing is that if we can get that right, we can change our fly dressing. And this is the other main message of the book. The book starts with, in the preface, with "Welcome to the world of disruptive fly tying," and it is, I'm afraid, disruptive. We've looked at all kinds of different ways of tying imitations of vulnerable flies, selected those that seem to work really well for us, and put them in the book. And it is fuzzy flies as an art form, you might say. And of course, other people can do the same thing. You don't have to follow our precise patterns, but in some cases you do, because if you don't tie it that way, it doesn't behave in and on the water the way you want it to. So you might have to use a particular material that we found works. Other things that we've got to will come on a bit later, but there are ways you don't have to think in the traditional ways of actually tying flies in order to be successful.
This strikes me as real game-changing stuff, and quite a claim, yet the claim is backed up. And I suppose this is where it's been nice for you guys to actually say, well, actually, this is where we think fly tying, the direction we feel it is most productive, yet you have backed that up. So it's very difficult to argue against in that sense. Does that mean that from a fly pattern and a fly box, does that mean we don't need so many flies in our fly box now, Don?
Well, an interesting question I've often been asked when I've given presentations about this material is people say, what's the most common presentation of a casualty? Well, there is no answer to that question. That would be like saying, what's the most common appearance of a car that's crashed? It's a random event. There are commonalities to these vulnerable casualty flies and failed hatches in that there's always an abdomen and thorax. What's around them may be in any way, shape or form. Wings get torn off, they may have any number of legs or tails, but there's always a thorax. And even if there wasn't, for us, there's always a hook. So you've always got that curved shape of a thorax, whatever you do, even if you fished a bare hook. And so those features matter. I think what's happened in the past is people have put detail into flies to try and make them look visually more attractive. What we're trying to say is that the detail in the fly lies in how it fishes and how it presents, and that's a different thing. It's like fly proportions. You're always told that the wings should be so much the gape of the hook and the body should be so much the length of the shank of the hook. It's not so much that, it's how do you make this fly sit in the water, be it on top, in the film or underneath, in the way the natural does. And the proportions of how you tie the fly then are what really matter. We've tied flies that go beneath the surface and pop back up to emerge. We've tied flies that hang just subsurface. The thing we're working on at the moment that's really hard to do is to try and make a nymph sink through the surface and fish just beneath it, like about an inch or so, and still know when you've got a bite. I'm not talking about a floating nymph, I'm talking about something subsurface. And that's the new frontier. That might be book 3.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
Might be some more cameras for you anyway.
Yeah, it might be an article.
I'm also thinking it looks to me or sounds, some of the things that you're saying, that it's ephemera, the upwing flies that you're talking about. But is this pertinent as well to caddis sedges as well, Peter?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, what we've looked at is how do you tie the form of a sedge that is most available to the trout. And on the whole, there are 2 forms of in which sedges, caddis, present to the trout that are easily available to the trout. One is one that you, on the whole, don't see or you've really got to look for, and that is when what we call the ferrate adult, the pupa that is covered in its pharos, its shroud, and it's got 2 big swimming legs, and it's swimming up to the surface, either to hatch at the surface or to swim across the surface to dry land and hatch there. It's slow, jerky, and it's easily available to fish, and they look for it. In the first book, we had a film of exactly that happening. So a good imitation of that works really well. At the point where it hatches at the surface, it gets away really quickly. It's flash, gone in a flash. So actually fully formed caddis are mainly available, and they, on the whole, they don't just sort of float about on the surface very much. What's really available later in the life of the caddis is when it is either egg laying or it's finished egg laying. There are those that crawl down under the surface, like granum, for example, and that is a very underestimated available food to the fish, is the crawl down granum. It's all silvered. But most caddis flop down onto the surface when they've finished egg laying or mating, if they're males, and they spread their wings on the surface. They may twitch a bit, but it's a very recognisable format. And there's, for example, the Davy caddis imitates that very, very well. But we've just found an easier way of doing that with using coq de leon tips and tying them in at a 45-degree angle and putting an appropriate body colour in. And the fish love it because it's not going to get away. It's a vulnerable caddis.
This is wonderful to hear. As somebody who's not got behind the vice for quite some time now, I'm liking the sound of what you're saying. That is relatively straightforward to tie. Don, scruff is good, right?
Well, think of the term, obviously you've guided professionally, think of the term guide flies. What do you tie? You tie something that's quick and dirty, because when it gets put into a tree, you're not going to burst into tears. And yet those are the flies being used by people who really know how to catch fish. And we've not really got that message. Sorry, all the people who are guiding you are using simple flies, and they work. Now, you'd look in my fly box, and in amongst all the scruff and the things that look like they've been run over by an HGV, you will occasionally find some beautifully tied patterns. Well, I like to think they are anyway. With loads of unnecessary detail, and you'd go, oh, this chap doesn't practice what he preaches. Well, actually, when you look at it, you think, well, I like the way that looks. I just don't kid myself that extra detail makes any difference. There have been some marvellous flies tied where people used to put, say, a silver or a gold rib in, then they'd follow through with a piece of dark fly tying thread. Now, there was a chap, I think, in the Shropshire Borders, and he was a sign writer. So, of course, he did that to highlight it, just like you'd highlight a painted letter on the side of a truck. Does that make any difference to the trout? No. Does it make a good-looking fly? Absolutely. And fly tying for beauty, I completely understand. But the problem is, as a beginner, you see these fabulous flies and you feel completely inadequate. You know, you're watching master people tie these things on YouTube. And some of the patterns, you wonder whether you'll ever master them. Well, actually, it doesn't have to be that hard. So, yeah, Scruffy's pretty good. And for years, everybody you know says, well, as my fly got more battered, it seemed to get more effective. So why not tie it that way in the first place?
And it's not, you can't just have one fly, though. You know, I know very famous fishing writers who have ended up saying, well, I just need a little brown job. And actually, sorry, that's not what you need. What you need, you asked just now, you know, does this mean you need fewer flies? Answer, no, you need, if anything, more. But what you don't need is a fly box with serried ranks of the same fly, because if one of those fails, they all fail. And actually, what the fish are eating is so variable, so mixed up in terms of how it presents to the fish, and yet they all get eaten as vulnerable flies, that what you really need, and there are pictures in the book of sort of a mess of flies tied to different colours, different body shapes, different wings, things that are all scruffed up. And we learnt this from the States, really. We were talking to people about how to fish the PMD, which is pretty much the same as our BWO. It's the same species. Not quite the same species, the same family. And there are loads of different ones in the States. And they have, like our BWO, they have a greater tendency to fail to hatch and to have accidents after hatching. And they present in loads of different ways. And what the American, they asked us, how do you fish in this kind of situation? And we said, well, how do you fish? And they said, well, actually, we have to have a dozen, at least, different imitations of the same fly in the way that it presents to the fish. And you have to work your way through them until you get to the right one. And then that's your day. The next day, it'll be something else. So actually, we tend to fish with probably more patterns than we ever fished with before, when there were specified, you've got to have this kind of patterns. So you can't just have one. I keep getting asked by people, what is your favourite fly, Peter? What is the one fly that you would never be without? And we both get asked the same thing. And the answer is, there is no one fly. You tell me what is in front of me in terms of there's a fish, or there are some fish. I'm on this kind of river on this kind of day. What fly are hatching, or if no fly are hatching, and we need to get into this in a minute. Let's talk about terrestrials. What is my favourite fly to address that specific situation? And I might get close to it. I might try this first. The other thing we say, and it's very, very important in the book, when you tie these new and different flies, good old scruffy flies, but you're pretty certain what they're imitating, and they work, don't go through all your previously favourite flies, tying on one after another and failing to catch the fish, and then as a last resort tie on the new one. Don't do that. Tie the new one on first, because you're not giving your new fly the chance that it deserves to catch the fish that deserves to be caught.
You make a really interesting point there, and both of you, I was thinking about what you said and about the patterns that we have uniformly in our fly boxes, that I wonder if it is a confidence in having them there, in having invested time in tying them, or money in buying them, that you want to use them. Yet you're saying the scruffy patterns now should be, in theory, a little easier to dress, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Yep. So you're what has given me confidence is that you have backed this up. Yep. So there is that confidence. Now, you might say, and we often say, don't we, that there's something scruffy in the corner of the fly box that's been sitting there, but I've got this brand new beautiful fly I've got to give to the fish first. It is changing how we think about our fly selection in that sense, isn't it? Would that be fair to say, Don?
Well, the bizarre thing is, and I'm sure we've all done it, you look in your fly box and you've got half a dozen of a particular thing, and one of them's chewed up and scruffy and the rest are pristine. Do you ever pick the scruffy one out? No, you think, oh, let's have a fresh one. Well, that's probably the worst thing you can do. And I do think it needs saying, though, that if I was to go on the sort of streams you're fishing on in Devon, and I was prospecting with a fly, if you were to ask me what my favourite fly would be, well, Elk Caddis, Parachute Adams, a little Humpy, something like that as a prospecting dry fly, I could therefore be said to have a favourite fly in situations where selectivity is unlikely. But when you fish rivers where selectivity occurs, then you really do sometimes need to, step up to the mark and actually match what's going on. Because we've certainly had situations, well, the thing I said on the Kennet, I was casting traditional patterns to these fish, absolutely refused everything. The moment I put on what they were actually feeding on, I caught all 3 in 3 casts. But there are plenty of rivers where that doesn't apply, where there just aren't enough insects for the fish ever to get that selective. And this has given rise to the whole thing of trout are selective or they aren't selective. That's true some of the time, depending on which river you fish on. So everybody's right about this. The people who say trout aren't selective, that simply reflects where they normally fish and the kind of fish they normally fish for. People who think that selectivity happens all the time tend to fish very rich rivers where it does happen quite frequently. But even on those rivers, there are still times when the fish will take any fly, when there's no significant amount of insects coming down for the fish to lock onto.
One thing you learn when you video fish a lot, and video from underwater a lot, is that first thing you discover is how difficult it is for a fish to actually see a perfect dun coming down, because it really doesn't show up in the surface and the surface is really messy. What you then discover is how much further ahead upstream in the current they can see things that are sticking down through the surface. And the more they stick down through the surface, the better they can see them. So it's great to have done it, but we've both fished for years clinkhammers and Parachute Adamses. And what sticks down through the surface, in the case of the Parachute Adams, there's usually some air hanging around the body of the fly. It sticks down through the surface at a slight angle. You've got all the fuzz and the messiness of the parachute hackle, and you can see it because there's a little white wing sticking up, so you can see the darn thing. So Parachute Adam is probably the most popular dry fly worldwide at any given moment. And clinkhammer also. One of the reasons why they're both so successful is that the fish can see the bits of the fly very clearly that are sticking down through the surface. In the case of the clinkhammer, for example, it is the curved abdomen and the thorax. That's what they can see clearly. That's what our video shows is the thing that most characterises what they're feeding on. So it isn't, that other people have tied these flies, made them work, popularised them worldwide, and it's absolutely great. All we've discovered is there's a reason for that. And if you take those lessons and apply them to other new flies that you might want to behave slightly differently. So, for example, if you take that curved body and thorax and you say, okay, we've had some wonderful spinner flies, for example, spinner patterns, in which the hook has been bent sideways, the shank of the hook's been bent sideways to imitate the curve of the fly, and then you just smack your head, your forehead, and say, okay, but why don't we just use a curved hook and tie a fly on it in such a way that it floats down flat in the surface? That way we haven't got the big hairy horrible iron hook sticking down in the surface. We've got something that floats down in the surface, actually does a better job of imitating the floating spinner or indeed the casualty, and try that and see if it works. And so we tried that, and we tried it on some well authenticated, heavily experimented on BWO spinner falls in the evening on the Hampshire Avon just over the road, and boy, did it work. So we've ended up with a whole set of flat in the film flies that imitate both casualty duns and spinners. They're very, very easy to tie, that float like hell, and all you need to do is to get the wings right, and on the whole not bother about legs. Very simple, very effective.
There we have it. And Don, it was interesting what you were saying about rivers at home. And one of the things the podcast we try and do is get people to think about how they're fishing, waiting to see that fish. Even I do at home on my home river. So I guess I'm playing into the hands of the selective feeder because I'm watching that fish and looking for that. So there's no reason whatsoever the flies that you're talking about wouldn't work in any way, shape or form. They're going to, without a shadow of a doubt. So it's already got my mind racing. I'm feeling a whole lot better. You mentioned the clink hammer. One publication published a fly, my variant of a clink hammer, which was known as the scruffy clink. I called it the shit hammer because it looked like that, but it was just tied with rough seal's fur and seemed to work relatively well. So I guess the thought was in my mind, but giving me the confidence now from what you guys have talked about this morning has already got me thinking about trying to find that again. We touched on terrestrials, but Don, I think you wanted to add to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a high floating dun, conventional wisdom was that the fish saw the little 6 footprints drifting down, and that was what initiated the rise. And in the first book, we challenged that and thought that the fish actually started to rise only once the fly had come into the window. Having now looked at processing these photographs with the computer software to see what the fish can see, there is no way any fish can see 6 little footprints as anything other than a blur more than 12 inches away. And in which point they will join all the other little bits of blurred debris on the surface of the river. So I just cannot believe that triggers things at all. So if you're still tying your high floating flies, they're only going to be seen when they go into the fish's window. So as a searching pattern, you really want something that hangs below the surface because it's going to be seen by more of the fish more of the time. When I'm using those high floating patterns, or patterns that float as high as a fly tyer can make them, and they all are penetrating the surface a bit on a river like the Dart, I'm generally casting to pockets of water where I think fish will be. So I'm putting the fly into their window, I'm doing the searching. But if you're fishing a broad area of river, a fly that hangs down will inevitably be more successful. It will just be seen by more of the fish for more of the time. And we've always wondered why clink hammers were successful. It's because fish can see them.
And we have some very interesting patterns in there where we've revisited the upside down fly and made it work. And if you can make the abdomen of the fly so water resistant, so high floating that it bends the surface, so it gives something that the fish can see, like the body of a mayfly does when it's actually hatched. The fly is heavy enough that it bends the surface. You see a silver indentation when you film it from underneath. If we can do that, we will get something that is seen outside the window. The fish can see it a good way away. It doesn't, and yet it is dry, and the hook is sticking up, so it isn't sticking down through the surface. It really works in mayfly time. It works in medium-sized flies. It's very, very difficult to make it work in very small flies, which is what we mainly get at this time of year.
The other thing with the upside down fly, when we tried this method of using a CDC dub body so the thing just sat just in the surface, because you haven't got the keel effect of the hook hanging down, the hook's up in the air, it's very easy if you want to twitch or skate the fly. It skates beautifully. And this is along the lines of Gary LaFontaine did a skittering caddis on a Swedish dry fly hook. Hook you can sadly not get anymore. But that was a similar idea. The thing just lay in the surface with the hook above. So if you wanted to twitch it, it twitched beautifully.
And some of them do it themselves. There's a fly in the book called Peter's Trembler.
Do we have to go there?
I wish. at my age.
But that's wonderful to hear, and again, it's, you know, inspiring to hear. What I think this is going to do is give myself, but I think listeners, confidence to search these ideas and concepts out. And you touched, Peter, on terrestrials. Do you want to tell us, you know, we talk on here a fair bit about those, trying those patterns a little bit more regularly. Did you have any findings from your filming and your research that suggested terrestrials are an important part of the diet of trout?
Absolutely, yes, very much so. I mean, basically we started off, you know, trying to do it with the naked eye, or trying to do it with cameras that couldn't really capture what was going on because they didn't have the detail, didn't have the focus. You couldn't get it. You know, I've filmed hundreds of hours of fish rising to things, and I still couldn't tell from the film what they were until we got these better cameras. The context is that in recent years particularly, and this year in particular, the abundance of hatching fly has just fallen and fallen and fallen. So it's absolutely typical that as an angler you get to the river and you look at what's going on, and you often see fish rising, at least disturbing the surface. You can't tell what they're eating. There's no way you can tell what they're eating. And yet you would say, well, they're taking emergers, or, well, they're taking the nymph as it hangs in the surface before it hatches. And you might be right, but because there's nothing hatching, there's no fly flying away. Are they really getting every single one then? Because that's the only circumstance in which they could be taking emergers or paused nymphs. And the answer is no, it's very unlikely that they're getting every single one. There would be fly that aren't being eaten by trout. So conclusion to that, logic alone says they are not taking emergers, they are not taking paused nymphs. They're eating something that is in the film. And it's pretty much level with the film, and it's small and it's very hard to see. And so you then get into what we partly got into in the first book, we've done more in this one. You're into green fly, brown green fly. You're into ants, small ants. You're into beetles. You're into, wonderful, the alder beetle larva, which is a little black caterpillar about less than a centimetre long and fat and juicy and squidgy and with a bright skin and it floats down. You can't see it. I mean, you can see it with the naked eye. With a really good camera, you'll be able to film it. That's what we did. We've got a film of it happening. And you tie an imitation to float right in the surface and you let it float down under the alder trees and bingo, you're into catching fish like you never were before because you couldn't tell what was happening before. And then you get into midges, and midges, river midges in the UK, like in the States, very, very small, very hard to see hatch, tend to be hatching towards dusk, so that makes it even worse. And so you develop midge patterns that float right in the surface film, and they work really, really well. And now where we're working now is on, as Don's mentioned, we're looking at floating nymphs and midge pupae just under the surface and finding some ways of doing that where they don't sink too far, which is what they tend to do. But the whole terrestrial area is more important as proportionally as a source of trout food than it's ever been in the past. And there are, luckily, still quite a lot of waterside terrestrials to fall into the water. And the other thing is that a lot of them, when they fall into the water, doesn't take long before they sink. So an almost unexplored area, except by a few specialists who are winning, is sunk terrestrials. And that's another area where we've still got some further work to do. But boy, do they work. It's just, tie on a beetle and sink it and find some way of finding out when it's been taken, which is usually a bit of squidgy dough on the tippet. And you can really be in with it. So yes, terrestrials, massively important and increasingly so.
And Don, does that mean with the tying of these patterns, does the scruffy principle still stick and hold true?
The simplicity principle certainly sticks. My pattern for the older beetle larva is a bit of black thread, a 2mm strip of foam lashed to the hook, go fishing, or cut 1 centimetre of black suede chenille and lash it to the hook and grease it up and go fishing. All they're seeing is a solid black bar, about 8mm long.
Sometimes curved.
Yeah, and almost anything will do. I've actually chopped up beetles and just cut them until they're long and thin. I've cut everything off black dubbed flies and fished them. The big take home for the terrestrial, though, is that in the heat of summer, the supposed dog days of summer, a term I absolutely hate, because I've never actually found it harder to catch fish in the middle of summer than at any other time. You just do different things. When the aquatic flies don't want to come off in the middle of the day because it's high light levels and they'll get predated by birds, that's exactly when terrestrial insects are most active because they're warm. You know, you don't get terrestrials moving around early morning and as it cools down in the evening because they're just getting chilled. The air temperature changes temperature more quickly. And so you've actually got something that performs in the middle of the day when nothing else is bringing fish up. What's not to like? We've also got the fact that this older beetle, can't recall if we mentioned it before, is a new introduction to Britain. It popped up at 2004 at Manchester Airport, having obviously been on its holes. And it was a thing we used to have in Britain, but it was thought to have become extinct in 1930. Maybe they just didn't record it, but whatever, it's back now. And since it appeared in Manchester, it's spread east across the Peak District, it spread down the Welsh Dee, and in 2014 it popped up in Hampshire and it spread east across the chalk streams. And all you do is look at an older tree and you'll see the leaves are skeletonized. And you'll see these little beetles about a little bit less than 1 centimetre, very fat and black, glossy black-blue colour, and the larvae. But they do seem to be cyclical. Sometimes you'll see the beetles on the leaves, sometimes you'll see the larvae. And this year I've had situations where I've seen the skeletonized leaves, cast the beetle and it's not worked, but the larva has. And when you look closely at the leaves, you're in the cycle where you've just got the larvae and not the adults. So again, even within that species, they're selective to a particular life stage. The other thing is that we're used, if you fish a river with good fly life, to seeing regular risers that come up in a spot and keep rising. But terrestrials don't happen like that. They fall in by accident. Or actually, in the case of the older beetle, it's genetically programmed that when the larva gets to a certain size, it chucks itself off the tree to land on the ground to go and pupate. And it's a bit of a bugger if that tree happens to hang over a trout stream. So these boys are actually jumping off on purpose. But they are flies that you can use at times when upwing flies won't be coming off. The big issue is that often they're happening under trees because that's where most of the terrestrials are, unless it's a windy day and they're getting blown on. And from a distance, you look at a shadow under a tree on a bright sunny day and you can't see into that shadow. It's like looking at a house from a distance. The windows always look black, but you walk up close, you can see in. So the secret is to get in the water if you can, or if you can't, get as close to that shadow as you can, so that it's more of your vision, and then you'll be able to see under the tree. If you stand from a distance, you won't be able to do that. And we had a wonderful example on the Derbyshire Derwent. I was catching fish on the beetle under a big sycamore tree, and Peter and another friend were standing on the bank in bright sunlight, constantly saying, "Are the fish still rising?" And I'm close to them, I can see they're still rising. I had plenty of fish from under that tree, but you just couldn't see the rises at all.
Quite right, yep. Couldn't see.
That's fascinating.
On the upwing fly thing, though, one thing to bear in mind is, as Peter says, that they're probably not taking emergers or rising nymphs because of a hatch. That doesn't mean they won't be taking casualties from a hatch upstream that you haven't seen, or the shucks created from that. And we've actually had this where fish were rising and a pal and I spent 2 hours pathetically thrashing the water, catching nothing, until I did what I should have done, which was to go in with a sample net. And what have I got in the net? Dozens of blue-winged olive shucks. We hadn't seen a dun all day. They're obviously hatching upstream. And my pal put on a grey shipman's buzzer, about a size 18, greased up, and we caught pretty well every riser we presented it to. And we'd spent 2 hours trying to catch these things. And that was just a hatch that happened out of our sight. So don't assume it's not an upwing fly thing or a casualty thing. You may not be seeing the hatch that's making those casualties.
Yeah, same with spinners.
Yeah.
You know, the spinners may be falling anything up to half a mile upstream of you and just coming down, and where they get concentrated by the current, that's where the fish will be. And you won't see a hatching. So some of those, I was referring earlier to the rises or the disturbances of the surface that are caused by fish eating stuff. You can't see what they're eating. You may think, oh, it's pause nymphs or it's emergers, but actually what it is spinners, and it'll be Batis spinners, olive spinners, that are floating down immediately under the surface, and they can be coming from a long way, and there can be a lot of them. And they'll be mainly, the female spinner, so there won't be that, bright coloration. There'll be the sort of deep, darky, reddy kind of thing. And you can be very successful just fishing right in the surface film with a spinner pattern.
And I would love to tell you that it's possible to look at the rise form and discern what's going on, but that's not what we found. In fact, we actually stood probably 5 or 6 feet away from several rising fish filming them. And after filming for an hour at close range with a big zoom lens, we would both have sworn on our family's lives that these fish were not breaking the surface. When we went home and looked at the video in slow motion, you could quite clearly see the upper jaw just come out. So these were taking things on top, not subsurface. But at 6 feet, you couldn't tell. Mm. So it's one of those things where you need to get in with a sample net. That has saved my bacon so many times. I can't say how important I think that is. That you're seeing these rise forms, you can thrash away with a whole variety of randomly picked flies. Nothing beats getting in the river and taking a sample. The problem is, if you put your net in on the surface, because you get turbulence in the water, what you catch in the net, it will not tell you whether it's on, in or beneath the surface. All things will look the same when you've caught them. So unless you can actually see them coming down into your net, and you're looking pretty close at that point, the assumption has got to be they're under the water. And obviously if you've got a spinner that's completely subsurface, it's just trapped on the underside of the film, there's no way you can see that. It's just not possible. We don't see that with the camera, never mind the human eye. But the sample net is invaluable. You just got to make sure you are sampling a bit of the flow that's similar to where the fish is. If you've got multiple current strands, the one in a different strand, it might have different things in it.
If we were to list the things that we knew we should have done but didn't when we failed to catch a fish, the sample net in the surface film is we were too lazy to get into the river, maybe we weren't wearing full wading kit, or we were just too lazy to get into the river and do the sample net. Sometimes you eventually catch a fish, and we've got some very non-invasive throat pumps that, again, you're keen to let the fish go, and so you let it go. You maybe you hope you get a good picture, but you've failed to remember to use the throat pump just for one little suck on the fish to see what it was actually eating. And, we catch ourselves, we catch ourselves failing to do things that we know are necessary to do a better job on these fish in front of us. And it's embarrassing, honestly,
Well, we are bearing our souls here, really, aren't we?
We are, because a little, yeah.
If the net's so good, why don't I get in with the net and sample it before I start fishing?
Yeah.
And indeed, why don't I? Answer, because I want to catch fish and I'm so cocksure I know what they're taking, I just go for it.
Yep.
I like to think that's slightly in advance of the thing I used to do, which was walk along with my car park fly, and as soon as I saw a fish, cast to it without even wondering what fly I'd got on the rod. But the fact that I don't sample it first, if I go to a river I don't know, I'll often do a kick sample first to see what's in there. But I tend to leave the sample net for when I'm baffled, and you think, well, you'd have cut to the chase a bit quicker if you'd used the net in the first place, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It is a thing, though, if you fish rivers where you don't wade, or you're somebody who's not comfortable with wading, by and large that's unavailable to you, and it's a shame because it is the ultimate tool for working out what's going on.
There's something deeply psychological in this. The fisherman is still 80% gambler. You know, I'm going to make a bet. I'm going to tie on this fly that I believe in. And we do it. We catch ourselves doing it. And I think they're eating that. I think this fly will catch them. You tie it on, you throw it at them, it fails. You carry on because it can't have failed because it's my favourite fly, quote unquote, you know. And so it's part of the enjoyment of fishing. So we're not wanting to take that enjoyment out. You know, we can come across as very very OCD, very focused, and yet we recognise it in ourselves. You know, we have this part of the enjoyment of fishing is making bets. And who would take that away? Well, we would, but that's what's in the book.
It's always said, isn't it, that the most important thing is to have confidence in your fly. Well, that's fine if it's a fly that's worth having confidence in. If you're just confident in it because that's what you always put on, which of course leads to this is the fly that catches most of my fish, well, that's no surprise then, is it, if it's the one you always fish? We're all guilty of it a little bit, but I think actually analysing what's going on and trying to advanced knowledge of what trout do and how they take flies and what available food forms there are, that lets you fish with confidence because you understand what the different possibilities are. So the standard response, you know, these fish are eating something, I don't know what they're on, fish something small and black. Well, you know what, that works quite a lot of the time because they are eating things that are small and black, but it doesn't work all of the time. And so sometimes the analysis thing, that does give me some confidence. I mean, one of the first books I read was Brian Clark's Pursuit of Stillwater Trout. And I absolutely loved that book because it gave me a rational framework for selecting a fly. It wasn't chuck and chance it. It was, this is summer, there'll probably be damsels about, you've seen them. Oh, look, there's some shucks on these reeds. Yeah, there'll be nymphs swimming towards the bank. If I imitate that, at least I'm fishing something that's likely to work. So I think for when you're beginning fishing, how do you become confident without having caught fish? And I think sometimes that giving people the knowledge of a rational set of flies to use or a rational approach, which I hope we've managed to do in these books and videos, gives you some confidence as to what to put on. And it's great when you get an email back from someone saying, well, yeah, I saw that. It seemed to be like what I saw on your video. I did it and it worked. That just is fantastic. I really love that.
And in the book, there are life stage ladders of vulnerability for upwings, for caddis, for stoneflies, and for terrestrials, although that gets a bit more mixed. But there's a 12 or 14 points on each life stage of vulnerability. So if you want to think about it in a logical way, we're trying to enable ourselves and you to do that.
And it's very pleasing to hear this. And it is, you know, you're talking so much sense having looked into this deeply, but you know the sample net's a no-brainer, isn't it? And I used to have one. There used to be one that fitted over your landing net, and I used to use it, and I don't use it now. Why don't I use it? It's dumb, you know. So it even from there, it makes us think what you're doing with this, and what I'm walking away with this is that think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and use the clues even more. So in front of you that once you're in the river, like you say, the main thing, Don, when you're saying when you're fishing somewhere that you haven't fished before, but I'm thinking now, right, when I get back, I'm going to get myself a net, another one, unless I can find the other one, attach that, and then even on my home river, get a proper sense. All the clues, we always say on this, all the clues are in front of us. We've got to interpret them, and we make it harder for ourselves sometimes. Like you say, Peter,
when you do that, make it out of white muslin.
Yeah.
Don't nylon muslin,
Yeah.
you know. Actually, the ones that you fit over your net are black. You can't see half the things that the fish are eating because they're black.
Yeah, the best stuff's that no-see and bug mesh that they put on high-quality tents. If you go on the internet, you can usually find that. One thing to say, though, whenever you give presentations on this subject, there will always be somebody in the audience who'll say, but I've seen a fish do this. Yeah, of course you have. We're not trying to say all the fish do the same thing all the time. It's like any natural phenomenon. It's a bell-shaped curve, and probably at 5% of either end, they don't behave according to what rules we want to impose at all. So there'll always be somebody who will say, when you do a presentation, but I've seen this. You say, well, yeah, tell me about it. Has anybody else seen this? If a lot of us have seen it, well, it's a common thing. If not, it's a sort of an outlier. And the problem is, as fishermen, we sort of focus on the weird things that happen. And if you're not careful, you then turn that into the theory of that's how all fish feed. And that's not true. So, as a dentist, medical statistics, you can say you give this drug to the population and on 80% of the people it will have this effect. And 10% either end. Some people it won't help, some people it will kill. But in the middle, by and large, you can predict what goes on. And that's all we'll ever be able to do. You can never do a true scientific test on a single fish because you only get one first test. And that would be like saying, I give you 3 different kinds of antibiotics and the 4th one works. So that was obviously the one you needed. No, that was the one you needed after the first 3. So when you've put 15 flies over a fish, don't be so sure that the one you put over was the right one when it comes up, because you've already altered the rules. So on a single fish, you can never do a proper scientific test. But on a population of fish, and no one has got a lifetime long enough in fishing to do a true statistical population study, but we've tested a fair few fish and they do seem to perform along the lines that we've observed in the videos and with the photography.
And you get people who say, yes, but I fish a purple fly, I always fish a purple fly, and it works really well. Yep, okay, that's fine. There's a thing called oddity selection, which is dictating what the fish do. They're going for that like the killer whale that's targeting the odd seal. But also it could be that actually your purple fly is just different from all the other flies that this fish has seen because it's been fished for in Duffer's Pool by the fishing hut by 1,000 people this season so far, and yours is different enough that it thinks, oh, thank God that's not one of those things with a hook in it, and comes up and eats it. And so you've got to bear all this stuff, in mind. It's what makes it fascinating.
Yes.
Also, when you get very, very dense hatches, obviously the chances of your fly being picked out of the multiple numbers of naturals that are there decrease with more accurate matching of the fly they're taking.
Yeah.
Because if you make it identical to all the others, well, how are they going to pick yours out? The sad fact of life is, of course, you put any fly anyone has ever tied, however skillful a fly tyer, by a natural, it looks different. So you've given the fish oddity selection straight away by using an artificial fly. I've read lots of stuff, and it does work, of fishing things like size 20 royal wolves in a hatch of tiny batis on the Henry's Fork, when there's a fly every 6 square inches across 200 yards of river, that fly looks slightly different. They call it breaking the hatch and fishing something outside of what they're taking. And that will work, but the thing to remember is your artificial fly is already doing that because it isn't as good as a natural.
Yeah.
That's part of the awful logic of what we've been doing, is that there's this thing which I refer to as the unavoidable imitative deficiency. There isn't a single fly that looks anything, really. If you showed your artificial fly to a taxonomist, one of the really expert people who knows exactly which species looks like what, and you show him your artificial fly, and the faintest clue, and yet he knows everything to identify every single species that's possibly there on the river, he won't have a clue what your artificial is meant to imitate, and neither will the fish. So it's a question of forgetting about precise imitation, because you can't ever achieve it. It's a question of coming back to it, imitating something that they want to eat, that they won't have to spend too much energy going and getting, something that is something that presents something that is in their diet. It's something they're kind of used to. They're expecting to see something like that, but without precision. And then, that's the way we're headed.
Listeners, I hope you'll forgive me that we've gone over an hour here. We're an hour and a quarter, but this is too good. And it's my birthday as well. So hopefully you'll forgive me for going on a little further, because this is the 200th edition. But we'll start to wind things down a little bit. But a question I wanted to ask as well was that we're recording this. This will probably go out very early October. So, of course, grayling will start coming into our minds. Do you find that this translates to grayling in a similar way as well?
Very interesting question. We did present some of this material to the Grayling Society Symposium. And there are quite a few things we've discovered about grayling. Interestingly, the lower jaw of the grayling, when it comes to take a fly, protrudes forwards. So it doesn't come out in a sort of concertina like a carp would. The upper jaw stays still, lower jaw protrudes forwards. And we've actually filmed them feeding underwater. And when they take a fly, the position of the upper and lower jaw is not that different to a trout. So all this stuff we've heard about underslung mouths doesn't seem to hold true. Things about them coming up to the surface and tipping back to take dry flies because of the underslung mouth. It's generally more the fact they rise from deep down. And what shocked us when we saw pictures of them, trout very often deploy the pectoral fins and just glide up to the surface, very energy efficient movement. But because the grayling we film were coming up through probably 6 feet of water, they swim really fast to get to the fly. And they're coming from a big distance, so they're more likely to misjudge it. And some of this dropping back is simply they've not got there in time. They're also coming up really quick and they turn over quickly on the fly and then they swim hard back down again compared to the trout just planing up with its pectorals, then altering and planing back down. The trout then swims back in the slow current at the bottom. The grayling's up and down and it's swimming hard the whole time. So that accounts for a lot of the things when they take the flies. Mouth's a bit smaller than the trout, so they probably can't take quite the volume of water in. And you see that with small trout. They come fast at the fly, and I think what they're doing then, they're using velocity to compensate for the fact they haven't got much volume in the mouth. And with the speed that the graylings swim up and the relatively smaller mouth volume, I think that accounts for a lot of the reason they miss flies. Some of it's just misjudgment. We tend to assume these predators are mega successful. I think somebody told me only 1 in 7 leopard hunts results in success. And sometimes trout aren't a lot better. We've seen them miss naturals loads of the time. That certainly happens with grayling.
Yeah. There are cases. We've had recent evening rises which turned out, when I finally had the sense to throat pump a big grayling that I caught, turned out to be actually nymphs, drifting, not hatching, Batis nymphs. And it was full of them. And that fish was right up, just under the surface film and behaving. I actually thought it could be a trout because it looked like a trout spinner rise, but no, they were grayling and I caught 3 and they were, big fish. So they can behave like that, but the standard default, as it were, grayling behaviour and rising to surface flies is exactly as Don describes, and that we film of it. They come up like a Polaris, grab the fly and go down the opposite to a Polaris, to the bottom again, and that's where they lie, and they're looking all the time upwards.
Fantastic.
Interestingly as well, we've all had situations where we've been sight fishing for grayling and we've been completely unsuccessful until we absolutely nailed the fly on the bottom. And this has given rise to this thing that underslung mouth, bottom feeder, you've got to get your fly bouncing along the bottom. Well, we've filmed them coming up 2 and 3 feet in chalk streams, taking nymphs mid-water, quite happily. So it's not always the case your fly has to be low. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You've just got to experiment with that and watch what the fish are doing.
Yeah, they're great points yet again. And this podcast has been packed full of them. Again, the guys, I've asked them to come on. I've bought a copy of the book and I've already learned so much. It's got me fired up. And that's why I like this process so much of learning. It's often said that as anglers that we're always learning, and again I've taken so much just from talking with the guys today, and I'm sure you have as well. There's so much information that is backed up by fact. That's hard to argue against at the moment. So this is why I'm such a massive advocate of it, and I hope that you will consider buying the Flies That Trout Prefer as well. Don, where can we get a copy of this?
It's a Kindle book, so you just go to the Amazon Kindle site, type in the Flies That Trout Prefer and it'll come up. I would make the point, we said this when we did the previous podcast about our first book, you don't need a Kindle to watch a Kindle book. You can download the Kindle Reader app. All you do is go to the site where the book is and it says read with our free app. Click on that link and download the app for your device. I would say it's best viewed on a decent sized screen, because as with the first book, all the pictures are zoomable. You can zoom into as big as you want, so you can really see the detail we're talking about. I wouldn't advise watching it on a phone. You won't see the fine detail in the videos. particularly the ones with the drifting nymphs. You do need a big screen to do that, but it can be viewed on absolutely any device.
Yeah, it's not that difficult. A very simple process to get the book. It's a very simple process to look at it, read it. Do watch the videos. It's worth taking the trouble to get to those links. The videos are very revealing about, and our work is based on them. So it is absolutely worth watching the videos as you go through reading the book.
And we've been lucky to talk with people who are pushing the envelope, pushing our pastime on, questioning, and we need to have people like this asking these questions, looking at the behaviour of our target species in depth. We're extremely lucky to have the two of you go into such depth and such analysis. So I think I can speak on behalf of many fly anglers who will be listening to this to say thank you, because it's wonderful to have something that enthuses me and excites me about fly fishing. Like you two, I've been around the block, I've seen a bit, but then when I hear this, I think, this is something new that I can learn. This is something I can take to the water and learn from. So
and thank you, Pete, so much for doing this with us. It's just great to be able to talk about all this stuff. I mean, writing it down is like heavy work. Making videos, watching videos is heavy work. We kind of enjoy that, but it's just wonderful to be able to talk about it freely and have that lots of people listen to it. So thank you, thank Fly Culture.
Yeah, I think if you ever stop thinking about your fly fishing, you've got to question why you do it. I can put my hand on my heart and say in 30 years of fishing the limestone rivers in Derbyshire, there's never been a day when I haven't noticed something different if you look closely enough. And sometimes that's the thing that will catch you fish. But again, thanks so much for Pete for having us. I'm super impressed that you managed to get the 200th episode and your birthday synchronised on the same day.
Oh, no, that's my podcast birthday, not my birthday. So that as an excuse.
I thought that was really cool.
And listeners, of course, you know the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to rifle through their fly boxes. I'm going to see if it works. I know it's going to work because it's backed up by this. So thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you get a copy of this book. I think it is an absolute game changer, and I think we'll all take a lot from this. So Peter and Don, it's been wonderful to have you back on the podcast. It's been wonderful to speak with you. Thank you from me as well for getting me so excited about our pastime even more. So thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Everyone, this has been the 200th episode of the Fly Culture podcast. Apologies it's gone on a little bit longer, but I think you'll agree that it's been absolutely worth it. As ever, there'll be never any charge for these podcasts, and it's wonderful that we're able to share this information with you. I'm super proud to have the guys on and be able to pick their brains just a little bit and get so much from it. But thank you so much for listening to the podcast. There'll be plenty more coming along very, very soon.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.